Snow fell in slow, whispering spirals outside the little wooden cabin, the flakes catching what little light the moon offered before vanishing into the dark. The forest beyond stood in silent watch, its tall pines cloaked in white, its secrets buried under a frozen hush. The creek behind the cabin, once a cheerful ribbon of sound through the valley, was now a long band of silver ice, glinting faintly beneath the pale sky. Inside, the world was smaller, closer, and warmer. The hearth burned low, its amber light painting everything it touched in honeyed tones. Shadows flickered across rough-hewn walls and danced along the floorboards, as though the cabin itself breathed with quiet life. Mary sat nearest the fire, her fingers busy with a needle and thread. The rhythm of her stitching matched the ticking of the clock above the mantel, a slow, patient sound that filled the silence between gusts of wind outside. She was sewing a patch onto Henry's little shirt, the fabric thin from use, her hands moving with the tenderness of habit. Her hair had slipped from its bun, catching the lamplight as she leaned forward. There was weariness in her posture, but also a grace that years of hard living hadn't dimmed. She glanced now and then toward the hearth, where her two children slept side by side on a braided rug. Little Sarah's cheek rested against her brother's arm, and Henry clutched the wooden horse his father had carved last summer, the paint chipped but the joy still alive in it. At the far end of the room, Jacob sat by the window, his broad shoulders hunched beneath a wool shirt gone thin at the elbows. His hands were clasped before him, knuckles white from the cold. Through the frosted glass he could see only shapes, the trees, the snowdrifts, the faint glow of a waning moon. But his eyes searched anyway, as if he expected to see something moving out there. Something more than winter. He had built this cabin 10 years ago, when the land had seemed full of promise. The valley then had been rich with game, the soil dark and generous, the creek alive with trout. He could still remember the sound of his hammer striking wood, the smell of pine resin, the laughter of Mary as she handed him nails from a small tin box. They had been younger then, braver maybe, and the world had felt endless, but the years had taken their toll. 3 poor harvests, the early freeze last autumn that killed what little corn they had left, the mule that went lame, the roof that leaked during the storm. He bore it all quietly, as men of his kind often did. But in the dark hours of night, when the wind pressed against the walls, doubt sometimes crept in like smoke. "Fire's getting low," Mary said softly, her voice steady but distant. Jacob rose, fetched a log from the stack near the door, and placed it on the embers. Sparks leapt up, swirling like tiny stars before disappearing up the chimney. For a moment his face was bright, lined, weathered, but strong. "I'll head out early tomorrow," he said half to himself. "Down by Miller's Bend, maybe. Ice isn't too thick there yet. Might find something still moving under the water." Mary didn't answer right away. Her needle paused mid-stitch, and her eyes lingered on him. She wanted to believe there were still fish to be caught, that the traps might hold something worth cooking, that tomorrow would bring a little relief. But the look in Jacob's eyes told her he already knew the truth. She nodded anyway. "Be careful, Jacob, the snow's deeper that way." He gave a faint smile that looked more like resignation. "I'll be careful." From outside came the low groan of wind through the trees, and then the sharp cry of a wolf far off across the valley. The sound carried over the hills and through the chimney like a ghost. Sarah stirred in her sleep, murmuring something soft, and Mary set her sewing aside to tuck another blanket over the children. Jacob returned to his chair by the window. He looked out again at the dark woods, their outlines blurred by falling snow. There was beauty in it, he thought. Cold, distant beauty, but it was the kind that kept its distance. He thought of his father back east, who'd warned him about chasing dreams into wilderness. "The land doesn't care about a man's hope," he'd said. "It takes what it wants." At the time, Jacob had laughed, proud and stubborn. Now, older and quieter, he sometimes wondered if the old man had been right. Mary broke the silence again. "Do you remember the spring we moved in?" Jacob turned. Her voice carried a trace of that old warmth, like a memory rekindled. He nodded. "I remember every sound. The creek running, the hammer. You laughing at how crooked the first beam was." She smiled faintly. "It's still crooked. Guess it keeps the place humble," he said. And for a moment the heaviness lifted. The fire crackled brighter, throwing their shadows large against the wall. The old clock ticked on. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of pine smoke and wool. Mary went back to sewing, her lips moving in a hum without melody. Jacob listened to it quietly. It was the kind of sound that made the cold bearable. When the logs settled and the flames died lower, Jacob rose again and checked the door latch. The storm outside was growing wild, rattling the window panes. He threw another blanket over the children and stood there a while, watching them sleep, the rise and fall of their small chests, the faint curls of breath in the cold air. He thought of the future, of what they'd eat if the snow didn't break soon, of the letter from his brother still unsent in the drawer. He'd written it weeks ago but couldn't bring himself to post it. Asking for help felt like surrender. And yet, looking at the children, he wondered if pride was worth the price of hunger. Mary's voice drew him back. "You should rest too." He nodded but didn't move. "In a while." She set aside her sewing and reached for the kettle hanging over the fire. Steam rose as she poured 2 small cups of weak tea. She handed one to him, and for a long moment they drank in silence. The warmth of the cup seeped into his hands, chasing away the chill. The flame shimmered in the reflection of her eyes, and he thought again of the first time he'd seen her, standing by the river near her father's mill, sunlight tangled in her hair. Somehow, through all the cold and hardship, that image never faded. "Jacob," she said quietly, "we'll be all right." He looked at her, unsure whether she meant it as hope or promise, but he nodded just the same. "We will," he said. Outside, the wind roared once more, shaking the timbers, and snowflakes rattled against the glass like tiny knocks from unseen hands. But within those 4 wooden walls, the fire glowed steady. The children slept deeper. Mary returned to her sewing, the soft rasp of needle through cloth keeping time with the storm's rhythm. Jacob sat beside her, his rough fingers brushing against hers when he reached for her thread. For a moment he forgot the hunger, the frozen traps, the long winter still ahead. The world outside could rage as it pleased. Inside this cabin, there was warmth enough to hold it back. And as the night wore on, the little family rested within the circle of lamplight and fire, surrounded by the creak of wood, the murmur of wind, and the steadfast heartbeat of home. The ember light flickered low but never went out. Not that night. Not ever. Not that night. Not ever. Morning came pale and soundless, the light creeping slowly over the white world as if afraid to disturb it. The storm had passed, but the snow lay deep and unbroken, draped across the valley like a shroud. From the chimney of the little cabin by the creek rose a single thread of smoke, straight and gray against the still air. Inside, the fire was low but stubborn, glowing under a crust of ash. Jacob stirred it to life with the poker, sending a small burst of sparks swirling upward. The room filled with the dry scent of smoke and pine resin. Mary was still half asleep, wrapped in a blanket on the bed beside the children. Her hair spilled across the pillow, silvering in the weak morning light. Jacob moved quietly, pulling on his boots, his coat, and the old fur cap that had seen more winters than he cared to count. His fishing line and small axe hung by the door, worn smooth from years of handling. He reached for them, hesitated, and looked back. Mary opened her eyes as though she had felt his thought before he spoke. "You're going," he nodded. "The creek might still have a patch open. If I'm lucky, I'll bring something home." Her voice was soft, but worry threaded through it. "It's cold, Jacob. The wind's cutting this morning." He smiled faintly. "I'll be fine. I've seen worse." She sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Take the scarf," she said, handing it to him. It was wool, coarse but warm, the same one she'd woven the first winter they came here. He wrapped it around his neck. "I'll be back before dark." The door creaked when he opened it, and the cold rushed in like a living thing. He stepped outside, closing it gently behind him, and stood for a moment under the open sky. The world was vast and blinding, white on white without horizon. The only color was the faint smoke from the chimney and the dark line of trees that marked the forest's edge. He started toward them, the snow crunching under his boots, each step a quiet struggle. His breath hung before him in clouds that dissolved almost as quickly as they formed. He carried no rifle, only his axe and fishing gear. There was nothing left to hunt but hope. The path to the creek wound through the pines, a narrow trail half buried beneath drifts. He followed it by memory, brushing frost from the low branches as he went. Every sound was sharp, the creak of trees, the crack of ice underfoot, the faint flutter of a bird disturbed from its perch. Somewhere distant, a raven called, its voice echoing through the stillness like a warning. By the time he reached Miller's Bend, the sun had climbed a little higher, spilling cold light over the frozen water. The ice shimmered in pale blues and silvers. Near the curve where the current still whispered beneath the surface, Jacob found what he was looking for, a small patch of dark water where the creek had not fully sealed. He knelt beside it, chipped the edges free with his axe, and set his line. Then he sat back on the snow and waited. Waiting was something Jacob knew well. It was the same patience he'd learned in long winters, in bad harvests, in the quiet ache of doing without. The water moved slow and secret beneath the ice. He watched the hole, watched the faint ripple, watched the horizon. Time became a long, thin thread. He thought of Mary, of how she'd looked in the lamplight last night, tired but steady, her hands gentle even in worry. He thought of Sarah and Henry sleeping by the fire, the way their small breaths had matched the rhythm of the flames. He also thought of the letter. The folded paper waited in the drawer, unmailed, accusing him with its silence. He could almost see the words he'd written in the firelight weeks ago. "We're managing, but it's been a hard season." He hadn't written the rest. The truth that the stores were running out, that he'd sold the last of his tools for flour, that sometimes at night he lay awake counting what little remained. The line trembled once, then stilled. He leaned forward quickly, but there was nothing, only the slow swirl of water under ice. He stayed until the sun began to sink, its weak light flattening against the snow. The cold seeped through his boots into his bones. When at last he rose, his fingers were stiff and raw. He wound the empty line, sighed, and started back home. The forest had changed with the dusk. The trees loomed darker, their branches heavy with frost. The air hummed faintly with distant sounds, the creak of ice, the groan of trunks shifting under snow. He quickened his pace. By the time the cabin came into view, the first stars had begun to show, trembling behind a curtain of cloud. Through the window he saw the lamplight flickering, small but steady, and the shape of Mary moving inside. That sight alone eased the weight on his shoulders. Mary opened the door before he reached it. The glow spilled onto the snow, turning it gold. "Any luck?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from his empty hands. He shook his head. "Nothing today." She gave him a small smile. "Then we'll make do with what we have." Inside, the children were awake. Sarah was humming softly as she played with scraps of cloth near the hearth, and Henry was building a tower from pine cones. The smell of cornbread filled the air, thin but warm and sweet. Jacob hung his coat by the fire and knelt to pull his son close. "What are you building there?" "A fort," Henry said proudly. "So the wolves can't get us," Jacob smiled. "Looks strong enough to keep out anything." They ate together in the soft orange light of the flames. The cornbread was coarse, the stew thin, but there was comfort in the warmth and in the sound of his children's laughter. Mary watched him across the table, her eyes reflecting both weariness and something deeper, faith, perhaps, or love that refused to bend. When supper was done, Sarah climbed into his lap, her small hands cold against his beard. "Papa," she whispered, "will the sun come back soon?" He wrapped his arm around her. "It always does, little one. Sometimes it just takes its time finding us." She smiled sleepily and laid her head on his chest. Within minutes she was breathing softly, lost to dreams. Jacob looked over her head toward Mary. "They deserve better than this," he said quietly. Mary's eyes glistened in the firelight. "They deserve us. That's enough for now." Outside, the wind began to rise again, brushing against the windows like a sigh. The fire popped and settled lower. Henry crawled under his quilt, murmuring something about the wooden horse he'd left by the fire. Jacob watched the flames dwindle. "Tomorrow I'll check the traps by the ridge. Maybe we'll have more luck there." Mary nodded. "You always say that," he smiled, weary but sincere. "And I'll keep saying it until I'm right." The clock ticked on. The night deepened. In the stillness, Jacob felt something shift, not hope exactly, but a quiet persistence, a belief that even in hunger, even in cold, Something good still waited beneath the snow. He kissed his daughter's forehead, tucked the blanket tighter, and took his place again by the window. Outside, the stars were faint, but they were there. And inside the cabin by the creek, beneath the watch of those distant lights, the family held close to the only warmth that never faded, the warmth of one another. The storm returned 3 nights later, fiercer than before. It came with a howl that rattled the shutters and pressed against the cabin like a living thing. Snow whipped across the windows, erasing the world beyond. Inside, the fire roared, but could not chase away the sound of the wind, an endless low cry that seemed to speak in the voice of the wilderness itself. Jacob rose before dawn, though the light never truly came. The sky was an unbroken wall of gray. He moved quietly, feeding the fire, checking the roof beams for strain. Mary stirred beneath the quilts. The children huddled beside her, their faces red from the heat of the hearth. "Is it morning?" Henry murmured, half asleep. "Almost," Jacob said, though it was hard to tell. He opened the door to fetch more wood, and the cold struck like a slap. Snow had piled high against the threshold. He had to shove it aside with his shoulder just to get through. The yard was gone, buried under a white ocean. The fence posts stuck up like broken ribs from the drift. He worked for an hour, clearing enough space to reach the woodshed, his breath rising in clouds. When he came back inside, his beard was crusted with ice. Mary was awake now, stirring a pot of thin porridge over the fire. The smell was faint but comforting. "Eat," she said. "You'll need your strength." He sat, wrapping his hands around the bowl. "If this keeps up, we'll be snowed in for good." She nodded. "Then we'll stay in. There's nowhere else to go." He smiled at that, tired but touched by her quiet courage. It was one of the things he loved most about her, how she never complained, never wept, even when she had reason to. By midday, the wind grew worse. It screamed through the pines, shaking the cabin walls until the rafters groaned. The children played quietly on the rug, pretending the sound outside was just wolves howling at the moon. Mary sewed in silence. Jacob sat by the door, knife in hand, carving another toy from a block of pine. Then, through the roar of the storm, came a sound that didn't belong, a faint, distant cry. He froze, listening. It came again, carried on the wind. A voice, a man's voice. Jacob set down the knife and stood. "Did you hear that?" Mary looked up. "What is it?" "I think someone's out there." Before she could answer, he pulled on his coat and pushed the door open. Snow blasted his face, the wind nearly knocking him back, but he pressed forward into it, calling out, "Hello, who's there?" No reply, only the storm. Then faintly, he heard it again. "Help!" Jacob trudged toward the sound, his boots sinking deep into the drifts. Near the line of trees, he found a dark shape half buried in snow. A man, collapsed and barely conscious. His clothes were torn, his hands raw from cold. Jacob dropped to his knees, brushing snow from the stranger's face. "Hold on," he said. "You're all right now." The man's lips moved, but no sound came. His skin was pale, almost blue. Without another thought, Jacob lifted him, heavier than he looked, and carried him back toward the cabin. The wind fought him every step of the way, but he didn't stop. Mary's eyes widened when the door burst open. "Jacob, what on earth found him out there?" Jacob panted. "He'll die if we don't warm him fast." They cleared a space near the hearth. Mary fetched blankets, warm water, and what little broth remained. Together they worked, rubbing his hands, pressing heat to his skin, coaxing life back into him. Slowly, color returned to his face. His chest rose and fell with a shuddering breath. Hours passed before the stranger finally stirred. His voice was weak, cracked by cold. "I lost the trail. Been walking 2 days. Thought I was done for." Jacob handed him a cup of water. "You're safe now. Rest easy." The man nodded faintly. "Elias," he murmured. "Name's Elias Turner." Was heading north. "To the trade road." Mary smiled gently. "You're lucky he heard you, Mr. Turner." Elias managed a faint laugh. "Luck or grace, either way I owe you both." He slept again soon after, and Jacob sat back, exhaustion catching up to him. The storm howled on outside, but inside the cabin something shifted. The stranger's arrival had filled the air with new purpose, a reminder that even in the coldest world, kindness could still find its way through. For 2 days, Elias remained too weak to move. Mary fed him broth, wrapped him in every blanket they had, and told stories to keep the children from fear. Jacob tended the fire constantly, breaking apart the last of their woodpile. When at last the storm broke, sunlight streamed through the window for the first time in weeks. The snow outside glittered like crushed glass. Elias sat up, his strength returning. "I can't repay what you've done," he said, his voice rough but steady. Jacob shrugged. "You'd have done the same." The man smiled. Not everyone would have opened their door. Before leaving, Elias insisted on helping them however he could. Though still weak, he mended the old rocking chair, patched the leak in the roof, and left behind a small pack of dried meat and grain he'd carried from the last town. "I've got more waiting with the traders north of here," he said. "Take this. It'll see you through a while." Mary protested, but Elias shook his head. "You gave me back my life. Least I can give a bit in return." On the morning he departed, the sky was clear and bright, and the world glistened as if reborn. Jacob walked with him as far as the edge of the forest. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the sound sharp and clean in the stillness. "Thank you," Elias said, gripping Jacob's hand. "If ever you find your way near White Hollow, there'll be a place for you." Jacob nodded. "Safe travels." When he returned to the cabin, Mary was standing by the window, watching the sunlight spill across the hills. The air inside was warm, the fire burning low but steady. The children were laughing softly, playing with the wooden horse beside the hearth. "It feels different today," she said, turning toward him. "Lighter somehow," Jacob smiled. "Maybe spring's on its way." She crossed to him, resting her hand against his chest. "Or maybe it's just hope." He drew her close, his chin resting on her hair. Outside, the snow began to drip from the eaves in slow, steady drops, each one catching the light like glass. The sound was soft but certain, the first whisper of thaw. As evening came, the family gathered again around the fire. Mary hummed a tune, low and sweet. Henry built a tower from pine cones. Sarah leaned against Jacob's knee, eyes half closed. The warmth spread through the room, gold and gentle, and for the first time in many months, peace felt possible. Jacob looked toward the window, where the fading sun painted the snow in shades of rose and amber. The world outside no longer looked cruel. It looked alive. He reached for Mary's hand. "We made it through." She smiled, her fingers tightening around his. "We always do." The fire crackled, throwing its light across the walls, filling every corner of the cabin with a soft, golden glow. The night beyond was vast and cold, but within these four walls burned something brighter than any flame. Love, quiet and enduring, unshaken by winter or want. And as darkness settled over the valley, the little cabin by the creek shone softly through the snow, a beacon of warmth, of mercy, of life itself, the light that stayed, of life itself, the light that stayed.